In the spring of 1883, a woman stood on the platform of the Colder Creek Depot in Montana Territory with a trunk, a hat box, and a letter she had read so many times the fold lines had gone soft as cloth. The train behind her was already moving. The station master was looking at his boots, and somewhere in the middle distance, past the feed merchant's awning and the two horses tied at the rail, and the wide brown swell of the valley beyond the town's last building, there was a homestead that belonged by every reasonable expectation to the man she had come to marry. The trouble was that the man had been in the ground for 3 weeks. She had not known this when she boarded the train in Columbus, Ohio. She had not known it when she crossed the Missouri, or when the land flattened and widened and the sky became something altogether different from the sky she had grown up under. She learned it here, on this platform, from the station master, who delivered the information in a low voice and then looked at his boots again, as if the news were somehow his fault. "Russell Lawson," he said. "Lung fever. Went fast at the end." Nettie Crane was 31 years old. She had traveled 800 miles to marry a man she had never met in person, though she had met him thoroughly in letters, 22 of them over the course of 11 months, each one carefully kept in the tin box that rode in her trunk. She had met his handwriting, which slanted left and crowded the margins. She had met his thinking, which was thorough and precise about cattle and weather, and less precise, though no less earnest, about loneliness. She had met the shape of the homestead in his descriptions, the 160 acres along the eastern bench of the valley, the cabin he was still finishing, the 11 head of cattle that were, he had written, more trouble than they looked. She had met the hillside above the south pasture where, he had written once, and then not again, a man could stand and see the whole valley laid out like a page waiting for words. She had not yet met the grave. The station master offered to help her find a room at the boarding house. She thanked him and asked instead how far the Lawson homestead was from town. He told her 4 miles. He said it as if the distance itself was a discouragement. She asked if there was a wagon she could hire. There was a wagon. The driver, a boy of about 16 with sun-cracked lips, loaded her trunk without comment and drove her east along the bench road in a silence that suited them both. The valley opened as they climbed. The grass was just coming in, pale and uncertain, the way spring comes to high country, reluctantly and all at once. A creek ran parallel to the road for a mile and then cut away south. The peaks to the west still held snow. The cabin, when they reached it, was indeed unfinished. One wall had no chinking. The door hung slightly crooked on its frame. There was a lean-to barn that held the 11 head, and a corral that needed 2 posts replaced, and a kitchen garden that had been turned but not planted. There was a woodpile that had gone down to the last few rounds. There was a fresh mound of earth on the hillside above the south pasture, under a pine, with a plain wooden cross. Russell's nearest neighbor had put up because there had been no one else to do it. Nettie paid the boy, unloaded her trunk herself, and set her hat box on the crooked table inside the cabin. She looked at the walls for a long time. She looked at the single shelf that held a Bible, a farmer's almanac for 1882, and a tin cup with no handle. She set her hand flat on the table, feeling the grain of the wood, the roughness of it, the way Russell's hands had planed it but not quite finished the job. She did not board the return train. She did not that day, and she did not the next. She had come west with a purpose, even if the purpose had changed its shape on her. She was not, she had decided by the second morning, going to grieve a man she had never touched. She was going to grieve the idea of him, which was a different thing. And she was going to do it by getting to know the land he had described to her so carefully. as if he had wanted her to understand it before she saw it, as if some part of him had already understood he might not be there to explain it in person. That was when she opened the tin box. She had a legal problem, and she knew it. The station master had mentioned it obliquely, the way people mention things they hope you already know. The territory would have opinions about an unmarried woman and a dead man's land. She had no marriage certificate. She had 22 letters and a tintype photograph of a man standing beside a corral post with a look of careful seriousness that she had studied until she knew every detail: the hat brim, the way he held his shoulders, the shadow the peak cast across his left eye. She went to town on the fourth day and hired herself a lawyer for one consultation at $2, which she paid in coin from the small purse she kept pinned inside her coat. The lawyer was kind and precise and not encouraging. Russell Lawson had died without a will. The land was 160 acres filed under the Homestead Act, not yet proven up at the time of his death. As his uncompleted marriage prospect rather than his wife, she held no legal claim. Probate would revert the parcel to the territory unless someone demonstrated continuous use and improvement. If no one came, the lawyer said, the land would simply sit until another claimant filed. She asked who was likely to file. The lawyer straightened his papers and said there was a neighbor, a man named Dolph Marsh, who ran cattle on the bench and had mentioned the parcel to the probate judge more than once. She thanked him and went home. Home. She had already started calling it that, which was either a practical habit or a decision she had made without announcing it to herself. If there are two things worth knowing about Nettie Crane before the Valley forms its opinion of her, one is that she had grown up the fifth child of an Ohio farming family that ran on competence and short sentences, and the other is that she had spent 11 months reading Russell's letters not as entertainment, but as a course of study. He had described in those letters exactly how he managed his small herd, when he moved them to the upper pasture, how he watched for signs of sickness in the cold months, how he banked hay against the far wall of the lean-to barn where it stayed driest, how he packed the chinking with a mix of clay and dried grass that held through a hard winter if you packed it twice. He had described these things the way a man describes what he loves and trusts, without fanfare, as simple fact. Nettie had a good memory. She had also, over those 11 months, asked questions in her own letters, practical questions about the cattle and the hay and the fencing, because she had understood that marrying a Montana homesteader meant learning a Montana homestead. Russell had answered her questions with evident appreciation. The answers were in the letters. She read them again that first week, this time not for his voice, but for his instructions. The probate judge, a man named Alderman who wore his authority like a well-pressed coat, heard her petition in the second week of May. The courtroom smelled of pine resin and damp wool. 3 other men were present, including Dolph Marsh, who sat in the back row with his hat on his knee and his expression set to polite skepticism, the look of a man who expects to be entertained by someone else's impracticality. Judge Alderman ruled clearly and without cruelty. No marriage had been solemnized. No legal bond existed. The land would revert to the territory if it sat idle and unimproved. If she wished to assert a claim, her avenue was the Homestead Act itself. She could file in her own name, but to do so she would need to demonstrate 5 years of continuous residence and improvement. 5 years. Dolph Marsh shifted in his seat and allowed himself a small breath. The judge said he expected she would find the territory's winters persuasive, where argument had not been. Nettie said she appreciated his time and rose from her chair. She stopped once on the way to the door to look at Dolph Marsh directly. He met her eyes. Neither of them said anything. She went out. It was a Tuesday in May with a light wind off the bench. She drove herself back to the homestead in the hired wagon. unharnessed the horse, replaced him in the corral, and went to inspect the chinking on the north wall, because that was where Russell had written the cold came in first. She had a second problem, a smaller one and a more immediate one. She had money for perhaps 6 weeks if she was careful, and the woodpile was low and the garden wanted seed, and 2 of the corral posts were soft with rot and needed replacing before one of the cattle found the weak spot on a cold night and walked out into open country. She spent 50 cents on seed at the feed merchant's, and the merchant's wife, who had been watching her over a bolt of yard goods, said without preamble that the Lawson place had been sitting half-finished since he broke ground 2 years ago. Nettie said she was aware of that. The merchant's wife said the winters up on the bench were something a person from Ohio might not be prepared for. Nettie said she had read about them and asked if there was any seasoned pine available for fence posts. There was another woman at the counter. She had been listening to this exchange with a kind of dry attention, and when Nettie turned to leave with her seed and her 2 fence posts lashed to the back of the wagon, the woman followed her out and introduced herself as Clara Wiss. She was a widow herself, she said, and had a place a mile south. She had known Russell Lawson to nod to and had thought he seemed like a steady sort. She offered, without ceremony, to bring a pot of soup on Friday. Nettie said she would be obliged. Clara brought the soup on Friday and stayed 4 hours, and by the end of those 4 hours, she had helped Nettie rehang the cabin door so it closed flush, and they had together assessed the garden, the chinking, the lean-to, and the herd. And Clara had offered the opinion that 11 head was not an impossible number for one person if the person was attentive and the hay held. Nettie asked about hay. Clara said there was a meadow on the east side of the parcel that Russell had been planning to cut. She said he had a scythe in the lean-to. Nettie found the scythe. If you have never in your life spent a summer learning a piece of land from a dead man's letters while the valley watches and waits, it is difficult to explain what the next 4 months looked like from the inside. From the outside, it looked like stubbornness and poor judgment, which is what most of the valley took it for. Dolph Marsh, driving cattle past on the bench road, would sometimes slow his horse and look at the homestead with an expression that was not unkind, but was definite about its conclusions. Other neighbors passed and said nothing, which was its own kind of opinion. From the inside, it looked like work. She planted the garden in mid-May, and it came in unevenly, the way a first garden in new ground always does. But it came in. She choked the north wall with clay and dried grass twice, as Russell had written, and it held. She repaired the corral. She moved the herd to the upper pasture on the 15th of June, because Russell had written that the lower grass went thin in dry summers, and the upper held longer. The summer was dry. The upper grass held. She cut hay in July with the scythe and her own arms, which were stronger than they had looked in Ohio, and stronger still by August. She could not cut as fast as a man with more practice, but she cut steadily, and she built the stack against the far wall of the lean-to where Russell had said it stayed driest. Clara came on 2 of those days and cut alongside her, and on those evenings they ate at the rough table and talked about practical things, the cost of feed, the likelihood of an early snow, the behavior of cattle in cold weather, and occasionally about things that were less practical. A husband gone, a life reconfigured around a different center than the one planned. Clara was not sentimental about loss. She was something better. She was straightforwardly present, which is a rarer quality than sentiment and more useful. The hay came in at a volume that covered the herd through a moderate winter. Nettie calculated this with the almanac and Russell's notes, which she had begun to treat as a second almanac, more specific and more reliable. She spent the late evenings reading those letters again, not for grief, and not only for instruction now, but for the way they built the place in her mind before her eyes could confirm it. He had been right about the meadow grass. He had been right about the upper pasture. He had been right about the way the light came off the bench in late afternoon, long and level, turning the pale grass the color of old copper. A man who was right about small things in careful letters was a man she could trust. The thing she had not expected was that she would come to feel over those summer months that she knew him. Not the way she had expected to know him, not through the daily accumulation of a shared life and its small negotiations. She knew him the way you know a place through its maker, through what he had built and left unfinished, through what he had planned and not completed, through the way his thinking showed up in the arrangement of the lean-to, the placement of the woodpile on the sheltered side of the cabin, the single shelf he had put up at exactly the right height for a hand to reach without looking. He had thought ahead. He had built for someone else's use as much as his own. She put that thought away and went back to the hay. September arrived with a long, clear run of warm days that the valley treated as a gift, and Nettie treated as borrowed time. She banked 2 more cords of wood against the cabin's east wall. She replaced the remaining soft corral post and a section of fence along the south boundary. She went to the feed merchant for supplemental grain and paid cash, which she had from the small amount she had carried, and from the sale of 3 dozen eggs from 2 hens she'd acquired from Clara in exchange for 2 days of fence work on Clara's south boundary. Nettie wrote none of this down in any ledger. She simply did it, one task after the next, the way the letters had described the homestead's logic, one thing holding up another, one season's work making the next season possible. At the end of September, Dolph Marsh rode up to the cabin on a gray horse and dismounted without being invited. He was a broad man with a careful manner and the particular way of standing that ranchers develop, weight on the back foot, as if always half ready to turn and look at something behind them. He said he hoped she was settling in all right. She offered him water, which he accepted. He looked at the woodpile, the repaired fence, the lean-to with its stacked hay, and said nothing about any of it directly. He said instead that a woman alone on the bench in the winter was a serious undertaking. She said she was aware of that. He said there were 2 or 3 ranches down in the lower valley that might take the 11 head off her hands at a fair price. He said the land, if she were willing, could be put to better use by someone with the means to develop it properly. He said he had heard she was a sensible woman, and that a sensible woman might consider what the territory's winters had a way of persuading people to consider. Nettie looked at the valley from her doorway for a moment. Then she looked at him. She said she expected she would manage. He put his hat back on, mounted his horse with the ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and rode north along the bench road. She watched him go. She went back to splitting wood. The valley's opinion, as winter came on, arranged itself into a kind of wager. Not a formal one and not a hostile one, only the sort that forms when people who have worked a hard land for years watch a newcomer attempt it without the credentials they consider necessary. They watched the smoke rise from the cabin chimney. They watched the cattle stay in the corral. They said among themselves that she would be down to sell before February. Clara heard this and reported it to Nettie on a Thursday in November, when she came with a wedge of cheese and a length of spare lampwick. Nettie said she supposed they might be right about February. Clara said she did not think so. The first real cold came in November and stayed. By December, the bench was locked in a dry freeze, the creek reduced to a thread under its ice, the cattle moving little and eating steadily through the hay. Nettie spent those weeks in a routine she had built without intending to. Up before light, fire built, water hauled and heated, cattle checked, hay distributed, breakfast from whatever the garden had dried or Clara had brought. The evenings she spent by the lamp with Russell's letters, sometimes reading specific passages about winter management, sometimes simply reading, the way you sit with a person who is no longer there and let their voice fill a quiet room. She was not unhappy. She was cold and tired and short on lamp oil, but she was not unhappy, and she knew the difference. The blizzard came in February, which the valley took as a kind of vindication of its predictions, even though the timing had nothing to do with Nettie's competence and everything to do with the fact that Montana in February does what it likes. It came from the northwest on a Wednesday morning, the sky going from pale to white to a blowing horizontal mass of snow that reduced visibility to the length of her arm within 2 hours. She had seen the signs the evening before, the way the cattle had pushed toward the lean-to wall, the particular pressure drop she had read about in the almanac, and felt in the air as something taut and ready. She had spent Tuesday afternoon carrying extra hay, filling every container she had with water before the pump froze, and banking the fire in the cabin stove with the largest pieces of wood she had. She went out into the storm at first light Wednesday to check the herd and found one of the younger steers down on his side in the lean-to corner, his breathing shallow and his sides heaving. He had been fine the night before. He was not fine now. What she knew about a sick animal in cold weather, she knew from 2 sources: the farmer's almanac in Russell's collection and a passage in Russell's 4th letter where he had described nursing a calf through a lung sickness the previous winter. The method he had used to keep the animal warm, the wet hay packed around the body to hold heat, the slow administration of warm water by hand, the way he had stayed with it through the night in the lean-to with a lantern and the patience of someone who understood that some things cannot be hurried. She did what he had done. She packed wet hay around the steer's sides and belly, working in the confined dark of the lean-to with the wind screaming through every gap in the boards and the temperature falling by the hour. She brought the lantern from the cabin and hung it from the lean-to's center beam, where it threw a circle of amber light over the animals. She hauled warm water in a pail she had to reheat twice, and she got the steer to drink a little on the first try and more on the second. She worked her fingers until they went numb, and then worked them back to feeling against the steer's flank, and then went numb again. The other cattle stood around the sick animal in a loose half-circle, the way herd animals do near something wrong. One of the younger heifers pushed close enough to breathe on the steer's neck, which Russell's letter had called a good sign, that the others stayed near. The second day of the blizzard, a smaller steer and a heifer that had been thin since October went down inside 2 hours of each other. She worked on both of them through the morning. The steer rallied by midday and stood, unsteady but standing. The heifer did not come back. By evening, the second loss was clear, and she did what needed doing and went back to the cabin and fed the fire, and did not allow herself to think too far past the next task. 2 head lost, 9 standing. That was the arithmetic. On the 3rd day, the wind dropped. On the morning of the 4th day, she heard the wind had stopped entirely, and she stood in the cabin door and looked at a world entirely white and entirely still. The lean-to humped with snow, the fence posts wearing caps of it, the bench road invisible, the valley below buried and brilliant in cold sunlight. Clara arrived that afternoon on a horse that had been breaking trail from her place for an hour, wearing every coat she owned and carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle that turned out to be bread and a jar of preserved peaches. Nettie stood in the doorway and let Clara look at her. Clara looked at the lean-to, the woodpile which had come down considerably, and Nettie's hands, which were wrapped in strips of cloth over the blistered patches where the cold had been sharpest. She said, "How many did you lose?" Nettie said, 2, Clara said. And the rest? Nettie said, standing. Clara came inside and put the bread and peaches on the table and built up the fire, and didn't say anything further for a while, which was exactly the right thing to do. They ate together at the rough table, and Nettie read Clara the passage from Russell's 4th letter about nursing the calf through the lung sickness, the method she had followed. And Clara listened the way you listen when someone is telling you both what they did and why they did not quit. Spring came the way it always comes at that altitude, slowly at first and then all at once, the snowpack releasing the creeks, the upper pasture greening before the lower, the cattle moving with more purpose and less complaint. Nettie moved them to the upper pasture on the 15th of June again, because it had been right the first time, and the land had not changed its habits. She did not forget the 2 she had lost, but she did not dwell on them past usefulness. The herd now stood at 9 head, and in the spring she traded 2 days of labor with a rancher 12 miles south for the loan of a bull, and by autumn she had 2 calves that were healthy and difficult and cost her 3 nights of interrupted sleep, which she considered a fair price. The valley's wager resolved itself without ceremony, the way such things do. The people who had expected her to sell before February found February had passed. They found March had passed, and April, and then it was summer again, and the smoke was still rising from the cabin on the bench, and the herd was still in the corral, and the garden was in again. The conversations shifted, not to respect exactly, but to a different kind of attention, the kind that calculates rather than dismisses. Dolph Marsh rode past the bench road twice that summer, and both times slowed his horse to look at the homestead. He did not stop. She did not invite him to. If you want to know whether Nettie ever truly settled the question of Russell Lawson, whether she grieved him properly or only used his letters as a practical guide and kept her heart sealed against the strangeness of the situation, the honest answer is that she could not have told you herself. What she knew was that she read those letters on Sunday evenings as a habit and a ritual, not for instructions now, but for the company of his thinking, the dry precision of his observations, the way he had written about the valley as if it deserved the same careful attention he gave to cattle counts and weather signs. She knew the letters by heart, in the way you know a piece of music you have played long enough that your hands remember it without asking your mind. She knew the one where he wrote about the hillside above the south pasture and the way the valley looked from there. And she had been up to that hillside enough times by then that she had begun to see it the way he had described it, as a page waiting for words. She planted a wild rose at the base of his cross in the spring of 1884. It took 2 seasons to root, and then it went quietly permanent, which seemed appropriate. In the autumn of 1884, a full year and a half into her residence, she went to town to see the lawyer again, the same one at $2 a consultation, and they discussed the homestead filing process in detail. She needed to demonstrate 5 years of continuous residence from the date of her original arrival in 1883. The filing itself, she was told, would need to be supported by witness testimony of improvement and habitation. She asked who might serve as witnesses. The lawyer said any 2 residents with personal knowledge of the property would suffice. She went home and wrote a letter to Clara. In the spring of 1885, Dolph Marsh rode to her place again, and this time he did not come alone. He brought 2 other ranchers from the lower valley whose names she knew from the feed merchant's conversation, men who ran larger operations and whose opinions had weight in the county. They dismounted at the corral and looked at the herd, which now stood at 11 head again, between the original 9 and the 2 calves that had made it through their first winter. Dolph took his hat off, which was the first time he had done that in her presence. He said the valley had been watching her situation with some interest. He said it was understood that she had managed a hard winter without losing the place. He said there were parties who might be willing to take the land and stock off her hands at a price that was better than she would have gotten 2 years ago. He said it not unkindly. He said it the way a man says something he believes is generous. She looked at the 11 head. She looked at the bench, the spring grass coming up pale and new. She looked at Dolph, who was holding his hat and waiting with the patience of a man who expects to be thanked. She said she was not interested in selling, and that she expected the homestead filing would go forward that summer. Dolph looked at the other 2 men. Then he looked at her again. He said the filing would require 5 years from 1883, which put the approval out to 1888, not 1886, as she seemed to think. She said she had spoken with the lawyer and believed the continuous improvement provision, together with the witness testimony they had discussed, would support an accelerated approval under the 1884 amendment to the filing process. She said she intended to find out. He put his hat back on. The 3 men rode back down the bench road together, and she watched them go, and then she went to find the scythe because the meadow grass was ready. It did not work out on the exact schedule the lawyer had initially laid out, because territory bureaucracy moves on its own calendar regardless of what farmers and homesteaders intend. She filed the formal claim in the summer of 1885, as she had said she would, with Clara's testimony and the testimony of the rancher 12 miles south who had loaned her the bull and could speak to the state of the property. The review took 14 months. The approval came in the autumn of 1886, 3 years and a half after she stepped off the train at Colder Creek with her trunk and her hat box and her tin box of letters. She received the document on a Tuesday. She put it on the single shelf beside the Bible and the almanac and the handleless tin cup, where it sat through the night while she cooked supper and banked the fire. And in the morning she went out to check the herd, which by then stood at 14 head, and had been her reliable measure of how the place was doing since the first morning she had counted them. Clara came that Thursday, as she often did, and brought a jar of put-up plums. Nettie showed her the document on the shelf, and Clara looked at it for a long moment and then looked at Nettie and said without ceremony that it was about time. They ate the plums and said very little else about it. The following Sunday, in the custom she had by then kept for 2 years, Nettie read from Russell's letters in the evening. She read the one about the hillside above the south pasture. She read the one about how he had chosen the parcel for the way the bench sheltered it from the northwest wind, which was the direction trouble came from in that valley. She read the one about the loan of a neighbor's bull in the spring, the neighborly economy of the place that he had expected would sustain them once she arrived. There is a kind of irony in the fact that everything Russell had planned for them together, she had done alone. And there is something that is not quite irony in the fact that she had done it with his guidance, so that in a practical sense she had never been entirely without him. The valley might have found this sad. Nettie found it sufficient, which was a word she used the way other people use the word fortunate. Dolph Marsh came to see her that October, riding alone on the gray horse. He stopped at the corral and looked at the herd for a while without speaking. Nettie came out of the cabin and stood at the doorway and waited. He said he had heard about the approval. She said she expected he had. He looked at the bench, the lean-to, the woodpile already half built for the coming winter, the garden cleared and resting, the hillside above the south pasture with the wild rose low and dark against the cross. He put his hat brim down slightly, a small nod without quite being a nod, and turned his horse and rode back down the bench road. She went inside and put the kettle on. What came after that? The valley gave the same patient and accretive quality that it gave to everything. The herd grew slowly, by design rather than ambition. because she had learned from Russell's letters and from experience that a herd a single person can manage well is better than a larger one managed poorly. By 1890, she ran 22 head and had hired on a ranch hand for the summer months, a boy from town who did not last the first winter, but came back in spring and stayed 6 years until he went home to Missouri for a woman he had been riding to for 2 years. She understood about riding to someone at a distance and wishing them well without reservation. She never remarried. This was not grief, or not only grief and not stubbornness. It was that the homestead had become its own sufficient reason for being where she was, and she was not unhappy, and she was careful, as she had always been, not to confuse the absence of a thing with the need for it. Clara was there most Thursdays through the years, and through 2 hard winters in the 1890s when the creek froze solid for 6 weeks together, and the cattle ate through reserves faster than calculation had allowed. Clara had her own troubles, a failing east fence and a wet root cellar, and a dispute with the county over a road easement that took 2 years and a considerable amount of patience to resolve. And Nettie was there for all of it in the ways that Clara had been there for her, present and practical, and unbothered by the performance of help. Her 2 daughters were born in 1891 and 1894. She did not marry to have them, which was its own kind of local conversation for a few years, and then became simply a fact about Nettie Crane, the way any fact becomes, absorbed and unremarked on once the novelty of it fades. The girls grew up knowing the herd count and the hay schedule, and the way the northwest wind in February meant trouble. They grew up knowing Russell Lawson's name, because Nettie read his letters on Sunday evenings through all the years of their childhood, and they grew up hearing his voice in her reading before they understood who he was, or what he was to the place. The elder daughter asked once, at about 10 years old, whether Russell was a relation. Nettie considered this for a longer moment than the child expected. She said he was something like a teacher. She said he had taught her the land before she arrived on it, and that was a kind of relation, even if it was not the usual kind. The younger girl, who was 9 at the time, said she thought that was a peculiar sort of teaching. Nettie said she thought so too, but that it had worked. She ran the homestead for 31 years after the morning she stepped off the train at Colder Creek, through drought years and wet years, and the long, slow change that came to the valley as the century turned and then turned again. The railroad extended, the town's feed merchant replaced by his son and then by a cooperative. The bench road graded and eventually graveled, so that a wagon did not lose a wheel to the ruts in the mud season. The 160 acres remained 160 acres. She never sought more, and she did not need less. Clara was still her nearest neighbor in 1914, when Nettie's hands began to give her trouble in the cold months, the joints going stiff in a way that the almanac had no entry for, and Russell's letters had not anticipated. She sat in the cabin on cold evenings with the letters in her lap rather than held open, reading them by memory as much as by lamplight. She kept the Sunday ritual until her hands could no longer manage the tin box's latch reliably, and after that she had her daughters read to her, taking turns through the 22 letters in whatever order caught them, the way a family passes around a photograph at a table, each person seeing something slightly different in the same face. The wild rose on the hillside had spread by then along the base of the cross and partway down the slope, stubbornly perennial, surviving winters that took fence posts and froze the creek and discouraged everything more ambitious. It bloomed in June, briefly and without ceremony, and for those 2 or 3 weeks the hillside above the south pasture smelled the way she imagined it would have smelled if Russell had lived to plant a garden in the sheltered spot he had described in his 12th letter, the one where he had tried to explain what he was building toward and had found, midway through the page, that the explanation exceeded his available words, and he had simply finished with the plain statement that he thought she would understand when she saw it. She had understood. Not when she saw it, which had been a grief-marked morning in a cold spring, but later, over years, the way you understand a thing that takes time to become clear. She is buried on that hillside, above the south pasture, where the valley opens below and the peaks hold snow until June. The marker is plain, her name and the years, 1852 and 1914. The rose comes back every summer without asking anything of anyone. Clara's granddaughter, who has the place to the south, sometimes walks up the bench to look at the valley from that height and says it is the best view in the county, which was exactly what Russell Lawson wrote in that last letter Nettie Crane had already read 800 miles away before she ever came west to see it. If a story like this one settles in your mind the way it has settled in mine, I'd be glad to know what you found in it. Leave a thought in the comments before you go. And if you have the time, there's another story waiting from this same hard country about another person who refused the verdict the valley handed them.